Welcome to today's webinar, brought to you by the Current Consulting Group and sponsored by DrugPak. Today's presentation is titled Why Drug Testing, and it is part one of a two-part webinar series. Today's webinar qualifies for one continuing education credit from SHRM and HRCI for those who attend in its entirety. You will receive information following today's webinar on how to apply for that credit. Today's webinar sponsor is DrugPak. As many of you know, DrugPak has been around for a while. In fact, it's over 35 years old. When DrugPak started, it was the only comprehensive drug testing management software available. Back then, it was an off-the-shelf product built to meet the needs of TPAs at the time and what DrugPak believed to be into the foreseeable future. As the drug testing industry evolved, so did DrugPak. DrugPak has been at the forefront of changes that process data faster and more efficiently. By integrating with the laboratories and the MROs, DrugPak has helped change the way business got done in drug testing and allowed their customers to get test results to their customers easier. Let's watch a short video that walks you through some of the features that DrugPak can offer you. Today, DrugPak is web-based, mobile-enabled, customizable, and fully scalable to meet the needs of any drug testing program. DrugPak loves creating software solutions for the drug testing industry. Please contact DrugPak and they will walk you through what they have to offer.
And welcome everyone to today's webinar presentation. I want to just start out by thanking DrugPak. If you have any questions or any of the services DrugPak offers, you're going to get this slide deck. It's going to have all of their contact information in it. And I encourage you to reach out to them. They're great people. They've got great products and services. Now, I'm Bill Current, and I'm going to be the presenter today. Many of you know who I am, but if you are not familiar with Current Consulting Group, we provide drug testing support services. We don't sell drug testing. We're not an MRO service or a collection site, but we do drug testing policies, supervisor training, DER training, etc. And if there's anything along those lines that we can help you with, please just reach out and let me know. This is our 27th annual, our 27th anniversary of being in business. We're real proud of that, and we welcome any inquiries about the things that we do. Now, today's presentation, here's the agenda, and we're gonna follow this agenda all the way through. But also, I want to encourage you to just submit any questions that you have, anything related to drug testing or today's topic, or even if it's sort of on the periphery of today's topic. Feel free to submit it, and we'll get back to you with answers. We'll email you a response to your questions and get back to you on that. So let's start out with some sort of introductory facts that I think will sort of set the table for what we're going to talk about today. So we know from the federal government that there are about 58 million Americans, 12 and older, who admit to using illicit drugs, and that 15% of the adults in that group are employed. So that comes out to about 1 in 6 workers who admit that they are substance abusers. Now, some very interesting facts that sort of, again, set the table for our discussion today. And I won't go through all of these in detail, but they give you an idea of just what it's like for that group of your employees that are substance abusers. They're absent more often. They're less productive on the job, 1/3 less productive. They are more likely to steal from their coworkers or from their employers. They are involved in more workplace-related fatalities that are the result of drugs or alcohol. And they are the ones who are more likely to file a workers' compensation claim. 38 to 50% of all workers' compensation claims are submitted by substance abusers. Now, this bottom number I'm going to share with you, but we're going to come back to it a little bit later, which is a result that came from a study that was done by the National Safety Council and the University of Chicago, NORC at the University of Chicago, that each substance abuser costs his or her company an average of $8,800 per year in all of the categories of the bullets that are above that last one. And so keep that number in mind, because we're going to come back to that later in the presentation. Now, every year at the Current Consulting Group, we conduct 2 surveys. In the first half of the year, we do a survey of the drug testing industry, third-party administrators, laboratories, MROs, collectors, etc. And the second part of the year, we do a survey of employers, the end users, the people who rely on drug testing. So from our 2024 survey of employers, we asked, why would you establish and maintain a drug testing program? And you can see all the different reasons they could choose from, or they could select other, of course. But right there in the middle, that orange bar, 85% said it was to promote a safe workplace. And then go up to the blue bar, second from the top, to comply with the DOT requirements, okay? Not a big percentage of all drug tests are DOT mandated. We'll talk about that in detail. But a lot of employers are required to comply with the DOT regulations. And then go down to the bottom to hire the best possible job candidates, 51%, et cetera, et cetera. But these are the reasons why companies maintain a drug testing program. Then we ask the question, are you seeing the benefits of your drug testing program? And look at that, 87% said they believe drug testing improves safety in the workplace. 61% said it improves the company reputation. Down towards the bottom, 63% said they're able to hire better quality employees. So when we go back to that previous slide, you see the reasons why they conduct drug testing. And then we go to this slide where we ask the question about the benefits that you're actually getting from drug testing. You can see that in almost all cases, the priorities that they establish for drug testing are being met by their drug testing program, especially when it comes to safety. So let's talk about the types of drug testing laws that affect drug testing. And the reason we're going to spend some time on this is because it is absolutely critical that you understand the laws that apply to you so that your drug testing program is as legally defensible and sound as possible. It's not to say that somebody won't come along and challenge the result of a drug test, but when your drug testing program is in good order and complies with the state laws or the federal regulations that apply to you, then typically those legal challenges go nowhere. Okay. Now, one of the questions I get asked all the time is, we are a multi-state employer. So which state do we base our drug testing policy on? And the answer is all of them, right? Because you've got employees that are working in Oklahoma, but also in Texas, but also in California, but also in Florida. And so you have to have a drug testing program and a policy, a written policy that takes into account all the different laws in the states where you do business. If you have workers who live and work in those states, then you have to have an addendum at least to your drug testing policy that takes into account the things that are different about the drug testing law in Oklahoma versus the drug testing legal requirements in Texas or California. California is a very restrictive state when it comes to drug testing, and I've got some information on that. And if you're in Texas and Florida, which are much more employer and drug testing friendly, you don't want to base your entire policy on the restrictive nature of the laws in California when so many of your employees live and work in states where drug testing is permitted without so many restrictions. That's why you want to have a base policy and then addendums for each state. Now, when we talk about state drug testing laws, there are lots of different things to take into account. State laws that are voluntary or mandatory, case law. This is, cases that have been decided by the court. California is a perfect example where most of the legal restrictions that apply to drug testing in the workplace in California come from case law. There's also workers and employment compensation regulations that have a direct impact on workplace drug testing. There are some states like Illinois that have industry-specific required drug testing laws. Public works contractors in the state of Illinois have a law that applies specifically to them. Other states, it could be mining or childcare, etc. And then there's medical and recreational marijuana laws, some of which, like in California, have very direct lines to workplace drug testing, a direct impact on workplace drug testing. So let's go through those in a little bit more detail. So when I talk about mandatory laws, I'm talking about laws in states like Iowa, for example, which has a mandatory law, which means that any employer in the state of Iowa that wishes to conduct drug testing must comply with all of the elements of that mandatory law. Whereas in Florida, where I live, we have a voluntary drug testing law, which means that it's voluntary on the part of the employer to participate in the program from the state. But if you do, in Florida at least, you qualify for a 5% discount in your workers' compensation premiums. So it's voluntary, but if I participate and follow that voluntary law, I get a benefit from it. If not, there is no other law in the state of Florida that either restricts or requires drug testing, how I do it, when I do it, who could be subject to it. But within that voluntary law, there are definite guidelines that you have to follow if you want to qualify for your 5% workers' comp premium discount. Same is true in Georgia or Tennessee, for example, just to give you a couple more examples. Whereas mandatory laws are like Iowa, as I mentioned before, or maybe Minnesota, or other state laws that are mandatory, meaning they apply to all employers that drug test in that state. I mentioned case law earlier. California is a perfect example of a state that doesn't have a specific comprehensive drug testing law or statute, but there's a lot of case law that has evolved over the years that essentially governs how employers do drug testing in the state of California. Now, some of you are probably thinking, well, didn't California pass a law that went into effect in 2024 that restricts how employers test for marijuana? Absolutely, that's true. And on January 1st, that law went into effect in California, and a similar law that applies only to pre-employment testing went into effect in the state of Washington. Those are not comprehensive drug testing laws because they don't get into who can be tested or when, but they do restrict how you test for marijuana in those states. And basically, just to close the loop on that, in California and Washington, it prohibits testing for marijuana. In California, it's both employee and pre-employment testing. In Washington, it's just pre-employment testing. But it restricts testing with a method that is only capable of detecting the metabolite, the non-psychoactive metabolite of cannabis, whereas, which would be like urine testing, for example. Urine testing detects the metabolite of the drug, whereas with oral fluid testing, you're actually detecting the presence of the parent drug, the drug itself. And so in California, if you want to test your employees for marijuana, you can do so with oral fluid testing. You just can't do it with urine testing. Now, you can test for other drugs with urine. The law only applies to marijuana. Okay, so that's sort of closing the loop on that. It's not exactly case law, but in California, most drug testing issues were settled through case law. Now, I mentioned workers' comp and unemployment comp denial laws. There are a whole bunch of states, almost all of them really, that have workers' comp regulations that allow an employer to move to deny workers' comp benefits if they can show that the individual was impaired or under the influence at the time an accident occurred. Now, even though scientifically we all know, we admit that a drug test, whether it's urine, oral fluid, or hair, does not prove that somebody was impaired at the time of the test. Many of these workers' comp denial laws, or the language within the workers' comp regulations that allows employers to move to deny benefits, will make that statement, that a positive drug test result can be used as proof of impairment, which then gives the employer the option of, or the possibility of, denying any liability for that workers' comp claim. Same with unemployment comp, just it's for unemployment versus accident situations with workers' comp. The bottom line here is that, say, for example, you've made the decision as an employer that you're not going to test for marijuana anymore. It's just too complicated, or it's legal in our state, or any number of issues or excuses why you come up with the decision to not test for marijuana, which personally, I think there's always a reason to test for marijuana. It's the #1 substance of abuse in the United States after alcohol. But let's say you decided not to test for marijuana. Well, when you go to move to deny workers' comp benefits because you believe that individual who was involved in the accident and who was injured was under the influence of marijuana, you're not going to have a drug test result to help you make that claim. And in many of these state laws with the workers' comp denial language, it allows the employer to use the result of the positive drug test as support for their petition not to have to pay the workers' comp benefits. So I think it hurts employers if they don't test for marijuana in a lot of different ways, but in particular when it comes to these workers' comp and unemployment comp denial laws. Now, I did mention that Illinois has a law that specifically applies to public works contractors. There are other states that like that, but that have their own industry-specific drug testing requirements. If you're in such a state and you're in that industry, then you must comply with those requirements that are in that industry-specific drug testing law. You wouldn't be restricted by any other law that may apply in a state to other employers. But if you're a public works contractor in the state of Illinois, for example, then you must comply with that industry-specific drug testing requirement that is only in that state and only for public works contractors. And there's more to it, of course, than that. But if you get into it, you'll see there's a lot of detail in these industry-specific laws, like the mining industry, or in the case of Illinois, public works contractors. And then, of course, the marijuana laws, the legal marijuana laws, the medical marijuana and the recreational marijuana. In many cases, not always, but in a lot of them, they have either started out with or they've added language to those legal marijuana laws that can place requirements or conditions on what employers can do with a positive drug test result. They might have language in there that prohibits employers from discriminating against medical marijuana users, or that require employers to provide some additional proof of possible impairment in addition to a positive drug test result before they can take adverse employment action or refuse to hire somebody, etc. So if you're in a state, and many employers are, if you're in a state that's legalized marijuana, either for medical or recreational use, I advise you to go in and look at those laws very carefully. Okay, so now let's get into the difference between the DOT required drug testing regulations and non-DOT, okay? The Department of Transportation has very specific regulations that apply to certain employers in certain transportation industries. So for example, and you'll have this slide, so if you're not familiar with it, for example, you could go to that first one, 49 CFR Part 382, which is the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration regulations for drug testing. It applies to CDL holders, commercial driver's license operators that operate commercial motor vehicles. And there's all kinds of, explanations or definitions of what that means and who's covered by it and what you would have to do if you are covered by it in terms of drug testing. We'll get into a few of those issues here in a minute. But other agencies within DOT also require drug testing. The second one is the Federal Railroad Administration, then the Federal Transit Administration, Federal Aviation Administration, the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration, and then the U.S. Coast Guard. Now, the Coast Guard is technically part of Homeland Security, but their drug testing requirements fall under Part 40, which is the section of the federal regulations that applies to drug testing of federal employees, as well as drug testing required by federal agencies. So Part 40 is very important. We'll talk about that in a second. But I want to give you a little perspective here. So we believe that there are somewhere between 30 and 40 million workplace drug tests conducted every year. I think it's probably closer to 40, and it used to be maybe higher than that before COVID, and then the industry lost a lot of volume. I think that's come back up again. So I don't think it's as low as 30. I think it's closer to 40. And approximately 6 million of those drug tests are DOT mandated drug tests. And most of that is coming from the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration, the FMCSA. So you can see that DOT overall, the DOT mandated drug tests represent a relatively small percentage of the overall drug testing, workplace drug testing market. Now there's other drug testing markets. There's treatment, there's insurance, etc. But for the workplace drug testing market, I think it's close to 40 million tests a year, and DOT is 6 million of that. So a relatively small percentage, but a significant percentage, right? We might ask the question, if it's such a small percentage, why all the fuss about the DOT regulations? Well, let me answer that for you. And as a precursor to that, it's important to understand that the federal regulations always trump state laws, and state laws always trump city ordinances. This is important because you may be in a state where an employer is restricted in how they do drug testing, like California, for example, and that testing for marijuana, and you can't use a test method that is only capable of detecting the metabolite of cannabis rather than the parent drug, the difference between urine and oral fluid. But if you're a DOT mandated employer, a DOT covered employer, because you've got CDL holders who are operating commercial motor vehicles, you fall under the DOT regulations. Those DOT regulations, which require testing for marijuana with urine, right now, oral fluid's been approved, but there are no labs certified yet for that under the federal guidelines. You must continue to test your workers and your job applicants in California for marijuana with urine. Even though the state law prohibits it, under the federal regulations, which trump state laws, you must continue to test for marijuana with urine, okay? Federal laws always trump state laws. State laws always trump city ordinances. There are city ordinances like in Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, two kind of really wacky city ordinances, I should say. If there was a state law in Pennsylvania that said X, Y, and Z, it would trump whatever the city ordinance says. Okay, now, if you're in doubt sometimes, and it can be confusing, my advice is to follow the narrowest definition, meaning go with the thing that is safest for you to do. Don't, kind of go out there and do the loosest possible interpretation of law. Use the narrowest definition of the law, okay? But look at that third bullet from the bottom. Drug-free workplace policies. Your written policy must comply with specific state laws, as I said. You must have addendums for those individual states that have drug testing conditions that differ from your base policy. So if you're a multi-state employer and you have a sort of one-size-fits-all drug testing policy, that's an invitation for legal problems, okay? You can't use a template or a blanket policy. It's just not sufficient. It's not going to cover the intricacies of every state law that applies to you if you're a multi-state employer. So the last bullet there, compliant policies not only insulate from potential legal outcomes, but also ensure that you are eligible for all available incentives, like those workers' comp denial laws that I talked about. Or perhaps if you're in one of the voluntary state law states, like here in Florida, compliance ensures that you qualify for the benefits offered by the state of Florida. Okay, back to the DOT regulations. Why all the fuss? Well, especially if most employers don't fall under the DOT regulations in terms of being mandated to follow those guidelines. One, some states, more than you can imagine, or maybe more than you might guess, some state drug testing laws mirror those federal regulations in terms of how a sample gets collected, the drugs that you can test for, at what cutoff levels the laboratories will test for the drugs, and that'll determine if a test is positive or negative, etc. And which laboratories you're allowed to use. Many state laws defer to those federal regulations as sort of the gold standard, especially in states that have either a voluntary drug testing law or an industry-specific law. Tennessee, for example, is a state that has a voluntary drug testing law that almost exactly mirrors the federal regulations for companies that participate in the voluntary program. Okay, the Illinois the Illinois Public Works Contractors law, I think, is very similar to the federal regulations. So we could look that up and be sure, but that's one of the reasons why those DOT regulations are so important, even outside of companies that are mandated to do the testing. That gives also employers a high level of legal defensibility if they base their program on that blueprint, if you will, of federal regulations. It puts you in a position where you can say, this is the standard that the federal government requires, and that's what we follow. And even if you're doing something that's not allowed under the federal regulations, like rapid result drug testing, if many of the components of your rapid result drug testing program are in compliance with those DOT regulations or Part 40, then it really just puts you on much more solid ground when it comes to legal defensibility. Okay, and then finally, if you look at that last bullet there, following the DOT and SAMHSA standards makes it easier. You don't have to make so many decisions about how you're going to do this, that, and the other thing, because you're simply following these guidelines that over the past 3 decades, with minor changes here and there, have proven to work. It's a solid way to do drug testing. Again, lab-based or point of collection or rapid result testing, depending on the kind of program that you have, depending on what your priorities and your objectives are. But those are some of the reasons why these DOT regulations, and I say that, but it's really Part 40 in most respects, come into play even for companies that are not mandated to follow those regulations, because they've just proven to work. They've just proven to be a solid standard to go by. They are the gold standard of drug testing. In some ways, when there's discrepancies or disagreements, even within DOT agencies about this or that, Part 40 becomes the great equalizer. So it's 49 CFR Part 40 from the regulations that as an employer you want to look at to find sort of that guidance on the technical issues of drug testing. And each agency must comply with Part 40. Now, it may not apply to some elements of their requirements, like the random drug testing frequency rate. For Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration, it's 50%, but for another agency, it might be 25%, or for alcohol, 10%. So some things are not covered by Part 40 specifically, but the technical aspects that give drug testing integrity, that make it possible for an employer to come back and say, well, here's how we do it. This is how the government requires it to be done. And that has proven to always, produce accurate, reliable, legally defensible results. That puts you in a position to be able to make that claim. Now, are covered employers under the DOT regulations required to have a written drug testing policy? Absolutely. Not only required, but there are specific things that must be included in your written policy. You got to state who the testing is subject to. Now, keep in mind as I go through these last 4 or 5 bullets here, is that part of the benefit of the written policy is for the employer or the job applicant. So they know what's coming, they know what to expect, and there are no surprises. So who's subject to testing, under what circumstances, when testing will occur, pre-employment versus post-hire, how testing will be conducted with urine at a laboratory certified by HHS, et cetera, what's considered a violation of the regulations that's spelled out in the federal verbiage, and then the consequences for policy violations. I'll give you an example. Let's say that you've spent a lot of time training certain employees. They're valuable to you, but somebody in that group fails a drug test. Well, the DOT regulations don't require you to terminate that person's employment, but they do require you to take that person out of their safety sensitive job, excuse me, so that they can go through a treatment or counseling or rehabilitation process with what's known as a SAP, a substance abuse professional, who can guide them through that process. They'll help them, work on their problem. And once that individual successfully completes the requirements outlined by the substance abuse professional, they're going to be subject to a return to duty test, and then maybe follow-up testing for some period of time. Again, that's up to the SAP, but you've retained that valuable person that you've invested a lot of money in. So I would recommend that as you put a program together, you talk about the consequences, you think that through very carefully, and the value of a return to duty program that involves a substance abuse professional, I think that makes a big difference, but that's my personal opinion. So then the question becomes, what about states, what about non-DOT programs? So virtually all state drug testing laws require employers to have a written drug testing policy. And typically these laws require employers to share that policy with their employees and with job applicants, and to keep it updated regularly. So whether it's DOT or non-DOT, you need a written policy. And the written policy, just like under the DOT regulations, is going to cover when testing is going to take place: pre-employment, reasonable suspicion, post-accident, random return to duty, and follow-up. So one of the questions we asked in our survey last year was, when do you conduct your drug testing? And you can see right in the middle, 89% said pre-employment. That's number one. Well, we expect that. Pre-employment's the most voluminous testing method, right? But then there's 75% reasonable suspicion, 71% random, 70% post-accident. That's really the bulk work of your drug testing program in terms of when testing will take place. There are other circumstances like follow-up and periodic testing, return to duty testing, that are going to be lower volumes, right? Because we're talking about, in the case of return to duty, somebody who's coming back from an absence, typically due to participating in substance abuse treatment. We would expect that to be a lower volume, right? Or follow-up testing, which is going to be like random testing of individuals who have come back from a return to duty process and are then subject to testing on a random basis by themselves. So under the DOT regulations, you must do lab-based testing. You don't have the option of doing rapid result testing. And technically, under the DOT regulations, you can choose between urine and oral fluid testing. However, we're still waiting for laboratories to be certified for oral fluid testing. So right now, technically, as I'm giving this presentation, the only option under DOT is lab-based urine testing. Outside of the DOT regulations, it will depend on the state law. Some state laws are very specific about how the test gets done, whether it's through a laboratory, or if you're going to use rapid test results, what kind? Can it be urine? Can it be oral fluid? Who does the collection, etc. So just be very careful about that outside of the DOT regulations. But usually there's a lot more latitude outside of the DOT regulations. For example, under the DOT regulations, the laboratory you use must be SAMHSA certified. But outside, some states allow other certifications, like the College of American Pathologists, a CAP certified laboratory. So keep that in mind. We did ask people in our survey last year, what drug testing method do you currently use? And as you can see there, and would have predicted, 92% said lab-based urine testing. Now it overlaps because many companies use more than one testing method in their program. They may do lab-based urine testing for pre-employment, but they do oral fluid testing for post-accident and reasonable suspicion because of different factors. Or they may use instant testing for pre-employment because they want to be able to make a same-day hiring decision, so they need a result right then, but then they rely on lab-based testing with urine or oral fluid for all other testing methods after hire. Now, the value of a comprehensive drug testing policy is significant. You have to have an updated policy and you have to keep it updated, but we asked the question in our survey, when's the last time you updated your policy? And you can see that about half said within the last year, but 24% said between 1 and 3 years, and 11% said it's been over 3 years. Well, things just change too much, too frequently, too consistently from year to year. So we recommend that you keep your policy up to date at least annually. Review the state laws that apply to you, especially the marijuana laws, and make sure that your policy is in compliance. Now, in that policy, I mentioned some of the things that are going to be included in a DOT policy, but always you're going to want to talk about why you do drug testing, your purpose statement, and who is covered by the drug testing program: employees, job applicants, And among employees, is it all employees, or is it just safety sensitive workers, et cetera? Which drugs you're going to test for, how you're going to test, obviously, right? Whether it's lab-based or point of collection, whether it's self-collected at the workplace, or you're sending people to offsite collection sites, et cetera. And then when the testing may occur, we recommend that you define what constitutes a refusal to test, because that's going to come up. If you've got enough employees, at some point you're going to have people who refuse. You can even look to those DOT regulations or Part 40 to see their definition of what a refusal is. And that could be treated as a positive drug test result up to a certain extent. And then define the consequences when somebody tests positive. Are you going to have a return to duty program? Are you going to put that individual in touch with a substance abuse professional? That's a great way to go, but that should be articulated in your drug testing policy, as well as the training that you're going to give to your supervisors in terms of the signs and symptoms of substance abuse in the workplace. And by all means, you need to have a dedicated section of your policy for marijuana. Now, that leads to the issue of recent use detection and the signs of impairment, because some state laws, some marijuana laws, have that kind of language written into their their legal marijuana statutes. And so recent use detection, an example of that would be drug testing with oral fluid, which detects drugs in somebody's system, the parent drug, within about 10-15 minutes after they use the drug. Whereas with urine, there's going to be about a 6 to 7 hour lag time before the metabolite, not the parent drug, but the metabolite of the drug becomes detectable in a urine sample. And with hair, it's going to be 7 to 10 days before the drug becomes detectable in the hair sample, but you're going to have that 90-day window of detection. So it makes it great for like pre-employment testing, but not practical for post-accident or reasonable suspicion. So if recent use detection is important to you, then you're probably looking at an oral fluid testing program, and you need to have that written into your policy. And then training employers on the signs and symptoms, as I said, but specifically what their responsibilities are when it comes to documenting aberrant behavior in the workplace that can trigger a drug test. So all of those things have to be in your policy. And as I've said several times already, but I'll emphasize it there, the last bullet, make sure your policy reflects current state laws that apply to you. And don't be intimidated by the legal marijuana laws when you put your policy together. Yes, have a dedicated section in your policy for marijuana, but don't shy away from it, because it can be quite an issue, right? We know that since the legalization of marijuana has spread across the country, that we've seen a dramatic increase in the number of people who admit to using marijuana. And there have even been a couple of studies that are really surveys that have come out in the last 2-3 years that have shocking results in terms of marijuana users who admit to using marijuana on their way to work, or who use marijuana on the job, maybe during their break, maybe actually while they're working. And so the marijuana issue is a growing problem. And I would advise all employers to have some language in their policy dealing with the marijuana issue. For example, in the policy, you can say, we will not tolerate employees bringing marijuana into the workplace, consuming marijuana during work hours, or being at work under the influence. That would cover people who smoke a joint or two in their car on their way to work, okay? And then that bottom bullet there, whether you will accept medical cannabis use as a legitimate excuse for a positive result. As I say, some state laws answer that question for you because they require you to do that. So be aware of those laws, but have a section in your policy that says what kind of marijuana related behavior is prohibited in case it ever comes up. It's in the policy, you can point to it, and that will cover you, okay? There's other prohibited behavior that needs to be articulated in the policy, like the outward signs and symptoms of somebody being under the influence. And you may even decide that you want to include in your policy testing positive for marijuana or other prohibited drugs or alcohol is also considered a violation of the policy. So when somebody tests positive, they would be considered in violation of the policy. And then depending on the state laws that apply to you, certain consequences would kick in. Okay. But again, don't let these changing laws scare you away from drug testing. Drug testing has proven to be a very effective way at deterring drug use and a very helpful way of identifying people who have a problem, who need help. And so drug testing plays an important role in maintaining a safe and productive workforce and in making sure that your investment in your workers doesn't get thrown away just because they test positive and violate the company policy. There may be a legitimate return to duty process that individual can go through that will, one, retain that individual as a valued employee, but also very much help them. And in the process, makes your company a better place to work, okay? That last bullet, impaired workers lead to workplace accidents, decreased productivity, et cetera. Those are all things that are easily documented because there's lots of studies and reports on that. So if you're considering dropping testing at all, I would advise against it because it opens you up to a lot of legal liability or exposure to increased legal liability. Drug testing protects against all of those trends and those bullets there. Let me give you one last example, okay? We're going to come back to that $8,008 per year figure that I used earlier. Let's look at the return on investment in drug testing because we're employers and we're in the business to turn a profit. We have to. That's the only way we can survive, right? And our employees are a big way in which we turn a profit as a company. When we have good employees who are productive, who know their jobs and do their jobs well, we do better as a company. So let's say, for example, your company has 1,000 employees and 15%, going along with the national average, are substance abusers. They're using drugs on a regular basis and they're often at work under the influence, or maybe they're even bringing drugs into the workplace and getting high while on the job. So that means you got about 150 current drug users on your payroll. And using that $8,800 figure from earlier, if each one of them is costing you $8,800 per year in accidents, workers' comp claims, healthcare costs, etc., you're spending, as a company of 1,000 employees, you're losing approximately $1.3 million a year keeping those substance abusers on your payroll without dealing with the problem. So now let's look at drug testing. If the cost of a drug test is $50 per test, and I don't know if you're paying more or less than that, but let's just use it to make the math easy, $50 per test, and your company conducts pre-employment testing. If you hire an average of 150 people per year, and if you have to sift through 1,500 applications to find those 150 new hires each year, if half of those applicants reach the pre-employment drug test stage, then you're going to conduct 750 drug tests, pre-employment tests, at a cost of $50 per test for a total of $37,500 on those pre-employment tests. So we know from the previous slide, right, that the cost of substance abuse, of maintaining those 150 employees with the substance abuse issue, is about $8,800 per year for a grand total of $1.3 million. And that your drug testing program for pre-employment only, okay, this is to screen out those drug users before you hire them, is about $37,500. And even if you double that for your employee testing, some random testing, some post-accident reasonable suspicion, it's going to come out to less than $80,000 a year for a company that's losing $1.3 million in keeping substance abusers on the payroll. That's a pretty good return on investment from the drug testing dollars that you're spending. Now, there are other examples, and it would take an entire webinar to go through it, but it's interesting, in my opinion, that different drug testing methods increase the soft dollar cost of drug testing. I'll give you one example. Say you send somebody to an offsite collection site to provide a urine sample, and they are being accompanied by a supervisor because there's reasonable suspicion of drug use involved. You're not going to, put that employee behind the wheel of a car and say drive to the collection site, right? So you're going to send a supervisor, at least one for sure, and those two people are going to be away from the workplace for anywhere from 2 to 3 hours. They're going to drive to that location. They don't have an appointment, of course, so they're going to wait their turn, and then they're going to drive back. And so you can see that there's lost productivity there. And so we asked the question, do you consider your drug testing program to be effective? And 66% said yes, very effective. 66% said very effective, 15% said yes, they weren't sure exactly how, but that's 81% that fall into that category of, yeah, it's effective. I'm not sure how to measure it, but it's effective. And there were very few people who didn't feel that their drug testing program was worth the time or the money. So in conclusion, here's our contact information. Part one of this three-part series is why drug test? Well, that's because there are a lot of people using drugs, a lot more now than say 10 years ago, and it's having a direct impact on the workplace. Drug testing helps deal with the consequences of that increase. Now, if you have any questions, submit them. We'll respond in an email to you and get you an answer. And with that, thank you for attending, and I'll turn it back over to Greta.
Thank you, Bill, for a great presentation. As a reminder to our audience, this webinar is part one of a two-part webinar series exploring a question on many employers' minds: why drug testing? Stay tuned for part two, where we will highlight the top issues all employers must consider when building or strengthening a workplace drug testing program. With that, let's go ahead and wrap things up for this webinar. On behalf of the Current Consulting Group and DrugPak, we hope you have found today's presentation informative and helpful. I want to thank Bill Current once again for speaking on this topic and sharing his expertise. If you submitted a question, we will answer you offline, and we will also send you information and a follow-up email on how to access the recorded version of today's presentation. In addition, we will also send you continuing education information for those of you that qualify to receive 1 credit for attending today's presentation in its entirety. Thank you for your attendance today, and this concludes today's webinar. Have a wonderful day.